There's a sound quarrymen used to talk about. Not the ring of the chisel against stone, not the crack of a wedge going in clean. Something underneath it, something that came up through the soles of your boots before it ever reached your ears, like the rock was breathing back at you every time you swung. Most of the old cutters laughed it off, said it was just stone settling, air moving through cracks nobody could see, the ordinary groaning of a quarry pit doing what quarry pits do. Then, in the late summer of 1884, one crew stopped laughing. They stopped a lot of things that year, and what's left of that stop is still sitting in a hollow outside a town most maps don't bother naming anymore. A block of stone 3/4 free from the bedrock, cut clean on 3 sides, and fused rough and jagged on the 4th, exactly the way 9 men left it 140 years ago. Nobody finished that cut. Nobody came back for the tools rusting in the dirt beside it. Nobody collected the wages they were owed, and for a long time, nobody wanted to say why. This is the story of what stopped them, pieced together from a foreman's ledger that wasn't supposed to survive, from the handful of names that show up in county pay records and then simply don't show up again, and from the kind of silence that tells you more than any confession ever could. The quarry sat in a fold of hill country the locals called Marrow Hollow, a low crease of land between 2 ridgelines where the limestone ran thick and pale and easy to work, or so the owners believed when they bought the mineral rights in 1879. The operation was small by the standards of the bigger eastern quarries, maybe 40 men on a good season, cutting block for foundation stone, and the occasional custom order for a courthouse or a bank front somewhere down the rail line. It was unremarkable work. Hard, dangerous, poorly paid, the kind of labour that ate a man's back and lungs and gave him little in return except a wage he could bring home on Friday. The foreman was a man named Elias Whitlock, 38 years old, originally from further east, a man who had worked stone his whole adult life and who was, by every account that survives him, careful almost to the point of superstition. He kept a ledger, most foremen did, for wages and hours and material counts, but Whitlock's ledger was different. He wrote in it the way some men write in a diary, small observations tucked between the numbers, weather notes, complaints about equipment, the ordinary complaints of a man running a crew of tired labourers in difficult country. That ledger is the only reason any of this is known at all, because in September of 1884, Whitlock's crew was assigned to open a new face on the northern wall of the quarry, a section that hadn't been worked before, where a survey had marked a seam of stone unusually pale and unusually uniform, the kind of stone that would cut clean and sell well. 9 men were put on the new face. Their names, as best they can be reconstructed from the surviving pay ledger fragments and Whitlock's own notes, were Amos Teller, Jonas Pruitt, Ezra Combs, a man known only as Old Rafferty, 2 brothers named Silas, and Ira Hobbs, a younger man named Daniel Marsh, who had only been on the crew 4 months, a labourer named Titus Grady, and a man Whitlock refers to only as the German, whose name is never given in full, only initialed HV in the pay column. 9 men, cutting into a wall of stone that had never seen daylight before. The work in the first week was, by Whitlock's account, entirely ordinary. The stone was good, the seam ran clean, the men made steady progress, opening a channel that would eventually free a block roughly 9 feet long and 4 feet high, a substantial piece meant for a foundation order out of a town 2 counties over. It was on the 4th day, according to the ledger, that Amos Teller first mentioned the sound. Whitlock recorded it almost dismissively, a single line noting that Teller had complained of a hollow note coming up through his chisel, a resonance that didn't match the density of the stone around it, as if somewhere beneath the working face there was empty space where there should have been solid rock. Whitlock's first instinct, and it's worth noting this because it tells you what kind of man he was not superstition but engineering. He wrote that he inspected the face himself, tapped it with a hammer at several points, and confirmed that yes, there was a variance in the sound, a section perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet where the stone rang different than the rock surrounding it. His conclusion, written plainly, was that they had likely struck an old fissure or an air pocket, common enough in limestone country, nothing to be alarmed by, though he noted they would need to work carefully to avoid a collapse into whatever void lay beneath. That's the entry for day 4. Day 5 is where the tone of the ledger starts, almost imperceptibly, to change. Whitlock records that the crew continued cutting toward the hollow section, and that as they got closer, more of the men began to notice the sound Teller had first mentioned. Not just through their tools now, but audible in the air itself, a low tone that came and went with no obvious source, sometimes present for an hour and then gone for the rest of the day, sometimes returning at dusk when the crew was packing up to leave. Old Rafferty, the most experienced man on the crew, apparently told Whitlock privately that he'd worked quarries for 30 years and heard settling stone more times than he could count, and that this wasn't that. Whitlock doesn't record exactly what Rafferty thought it was, only that the old man's face, in his words, held nothing I cared to press him on. By the second week, the crew had cut deep enough to expose the edge of whatever lay beneath the pale seam, and what they found was not an air pocket. It was a cavity, roughly the dimensions Whitlock's hammer test had suggested, but with walls that were, in his words, too even to be nature's doing, smooth in a way the stone around it was not, as though something had been carved from the inside rather than broken from the outside. He does not use the word chamber. He seems, reading the ledger closely, to have deliberately avoided that word, as if writing it down would have made it more real than he was prepared for it to be. What he does write is that the cavity ran back further than the crew could see with their lamps, that the air coming out of it was cool and carried a mineral smell none of the men could place, and that Daniel Marsh, the youngest of the crew, refused to approach the opening after the first look inside. Whitlock doesn't record what Marsh saw, or thought he saw. He records only that Marsh asked to be reassigned to a different section of the quarry, and that Whitlock granted the request without argument, which for a foreman running a tight crew on a tight schedule was, in itself, unusual. The company that owned the quarry, a small outfit run out of a regional office with a name that appears in the ledger only as the company men, was informed of the find. Whitlock's account of their response is brief but pointed. 2 representatives came out to inspect the opening themselves, spent perhaps an hour at the site, and left with instructions that the crew was to continue the cut as planned, that the cavity was to be noted but not investigated further, and that under no circumstances was the work to be discussed outside the quarry grounds. Whitlock records this instruction almost verbatim, which suggests it struck him as strange enough to preserve exactly. Cut the stone, the instruction read, according to his ledger. Leave the rest be. What's behind the wall belongs to the company, same as the coal and same as the timber, and it's no man's business but ours. It's a strange thing to write about an empty cavity in a rock wall, unless the men who said it believed there was something inside it worth claiming. Before any of that, though, it helps to understand who Elias Whitlock actually was, because the ledger only makes sense once you know the kind of man who was writing it. He wasn't a superstitious man. He wasn't the sort to see a shadow on a cave wall and call it a ghost, and he wasn't the sort of foreman who let his crew get away with slacking because of some story about a haunted seam. Company records that survive from earlier years show a man who was, if anything, harder on his crews than most, a man who docked pay for lateness, and who once walked off his own job for 2 days, rather than run a crew through a section he judged unsafe, only to be proven right when that section partially collapsed the following month with nobody in it. That's the man whose handwriting starts to shake by the 4th week of this excavation. That's the man who starts writing about sounds and hollow tones and marks in stone that shouldn't be there, not because he was prone to exaggeration, but because, by every account anyone can find of him, he was about as far from prone to exaggeration as a 19th century quarry foreman could be. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it's the detail that convinced the man who found the ledger in 1971 to keep it rather than throw it out with the rest of the rusted junk in that toolbox, and it's the detail that's convinced most people who've read it since. This wasn't a man looking for a story. This was a man trying, against his own instincts, to write down exactly what happened, in the same flat, careful hand he used for wage columns, because writing it down in that same steady way was the only method he had left to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. The 3rd week is when the account becomes harder to follow, because Whitlock's handwriting, by his own later admission scrawled in the margin of a later entry, began to deteriorate, and several pages appear to have been written quickly out of the careful, upright hand he used for the wage columns. What can be reconstructed is this. The crew continued working the face, cutting toward and around the cavity, trying to free the block of pale stone that had been the original purpose of the excavation. As they worked closer to the cavity's edge, more of the men began reporting the sound, now more frequently, now less like a resonance from tapping, and more like something with a rhythm of its own, independent of any tool striking any rock. Ezra Combs told Whitlock he'd heard it clearest at midday, when the crew stopped for their meal and the quarry went quiet, a low tone that seemed to rise and fall in a pattern too regular to be wind or water, too slow to be any machine on the site. Titus Grady apparently began sleeping poorly and told the foreman he'd taken to walking the perimeter of his cabin at night because he couldn't shake the feeling that the sound followed him home. The Hobbs brothers, Silas and Ira, according to a note Whitlock makes almost in passing, stopped speaking to each other entirely during the 4th week, though he doesn't explain why, only that the brothers who once shared every meal now sit at opposite ends of the fire, and neither will say the reason. Whitlock himself began visiting the cavity alone in the evenings, after the crew had gone home, a fact he records with what reads, even now, like genuine unease at his own behaviour. He writes that he couldn't explain why he kept returning, only that something about the opening pulled at him the way an unfinished sentence pulls at a man's mind, a question he couldn't leave unanswered, even though every instinct told him to leave it exactly as it was. On one of these evening visits, roughly 5 weeks into the excavation, Whitlock records that he brought a lamp deep enough into the cavity to see, for the first time, that the smooth walls he'd noted earlier were not simply smooth. They bore marks, shallow and evenly spaced, running in parallel lines along the stone in a pattern he could not attribute to any tool he recognized, chisel or drill or blast. He measured the spacing of the marks, a detail that tells you something about the kind of man he was even in a moment that must have frightened him, and recorded that they repeated at almost exactly the same interval, no matter where along the wall he checked, as if whatever had made them had moved in a single continuous motion, unbroken, for a distance further than his lamp could illuminate. It helps, too, to sit for a moment with each of the 9 men themselves, because the ledger treats them mostly as a unit, the crew, but the fragments Whitlock does preserve about them individually are what give the account its weight. Old Rafferty was, by every description, the closest thing the crew had to an authority on the ground itself. A man who'd started cutting stone as a boy in a different quarry entirely, and who had, over 3 decades, developed the kind of instinct for rock that no amount of book learning could teach a younger man. When Rafferty stopped bringing his lunch pail into the new section, none of the other men needed it explained to them what that meant. Amos Teller, the first to mention the sound at all, was by contrast one of the younger hands, ambitious, eager to be seen as reliable, which makes it more notable that a man with every incentive to keep his head down and his complaints to himself was the one who first broke the silence and told his foreman something was wrong. The Hobbs brothers, Silas and Ira, had worked together on that crew for going on 6 years by Whitlock's estimate, inseparable by every account prior to that autumn, sharing a cabin, sharing meals, the kind of pair the rest of the crew had stopped thinking of as 2 separate men. Whatever passed between them in that 4th week, whatever it was that Ira heard and told his brother, and whatever Silas's reaction to being told was, it was enough to end 6 years of that closeness in the space of days, and neither brother, so far as any surviving record shows, ever spoke publicly about what caused the rift. Titus Grady's sleeplessness is mentioned only briefly, but a neighbour's account, preserved second-hand in a much later local history compiled by a schoolteacher in the 1930s, describes Grady in that period as a man who had taken to sitting on his own porch through the small hours of the night, with a lantern lit beside him, unwilling to explain why, unwilling even to acknowledge the question when neighbours asked. The German, H.V., remains the most obscure figure in the whole account, never named in full anywhere in the surviving records. His daily marking ritual on the quarry wall never explained, though it's worth noting that whatever symbol or mark he was making, Whitlock never once tried to erase it or order him to stop, which for a foreman known to run a tight operation is, in its own quiet way, a kind of acknowledgement. This is the entry where the ledger, for the only time, includes something other than Whitlock's own handwriting. Pressed into the margin, in a hand that is smaller, harder, almost frantic by comparison to his usual script, is a single line that reads, "Ira says he heard it answer him." No further explanation follows. The next several entries return to ordinary matters, wages, weather, a broken cart axle, as though Whitlock was trying to steady himself by writing about anything else. But the crew's behaviour, described in fragments across these pages, tells its own story. Old Rafferty stopped bringing his lunch pail into the new section entirely, eating instead at the mouth of the original quarry pit, as far from the cavity as the job allowed. The German, H.V., whose full name never appears, began marking something on the quarry wall near his workstation each morning before starting, a habit none of the other men understood, and that Whitlock notes without further comment. Daniel Marsh, the young man who'd asked to be reassigned in the second week, quietly left the job entirely by the end of the fifth week, collecting his pay and walking off the site without giving notice, which in a labour market that tight, in a region where quarry work was one of the only paying jobs for miles, was itself remarkable. It was in the sixth week, according to the final substantial entries in the ledger, that everything came to a head. The block of pale stone, the original object of the excavation, was by this point nearly free, cut clean on three sides, with only the fourth side still fused to the bedrock behind it, directly adjacent to the cavity the crew had spent a month trying to work around. Whitlock records that the company men returned to the site, impatient with the slowed pace of the work, and gave direct instruction that the final cut was to be completed within the week, regardless of the crew's concerns. He records, too, that he argued against this, though the ledger doesn't preserve exactly what he said, only his conclusion that the argument changed nothing. The final cut was scheduled for a Thursday. What happened on that Thursday is the part of the ledger that has been quoted, copied and argued over, more than any other, because the entry itself is short, unfinished in its own way, as if Whitlock began writing it in the ordinary manner, and then simply could not continue. It reads, in full, as close to verbatim as the surviving pages allow, began the final cut at first light, 9 men present, though Marsh gone by now, and his place never filled. Sound present from the start, stronger than before, felt through the ground before the tools ever touched stone. By mid-morning, Coombs would not continue, and Rafferty stood with him. The brothers worked, but would not look at one another. By noon, the sound had changed, no longer steady, now rising and falling like something drawing breath. I gave the order to stop for the day, meaning to resume Friday with fresh minds. The men did not wait for Friday. They laid down their tools where they stood, and walked from the site, all 9, without a word passed between them that I could hear, and none has returned since, nor sent word, nor collected the wages owed them for that final week, which I have kept aside in this ledger's back page against the day one of them asks for it. I do not expect that day will come. I went to the face myself that evening, alone, as I had done before, though I tell myself now I will not do it again. The cut stands 3/4 finished. The fourth side remains fused to the rock, and I find I have no wish to be the one who finishes it. Whatever is behind that stone, I believe it does not wish to be freed, and I have come to think that the sound we have all been hearing these 6 weeks was never a threat. Not exactly, but something closer to a request, repeated and repeated, that we could none of us answer, because none of us understood the asking. Tell them the rock said no. That is all I have to write tonight. That is the last substantial entry in Whitlock's own hand. What follows in the ledger is sparse, administrative, clearly written over subsequent weeks and months by a man going through the motions of closing out a section of a quarry that the company had decided, quietly and without public explanation, to abandon. The new face was fenced off. The company's official reason, recorded in a brief note attached to the ledger's final pages, cited structural instability in the northern wall, a reasonable and unremarkable explanation that satisfied whatever regulatory oversight existed for a small regional quarry in 1884, which is to say, very little oversight at all. The 9 men who walked off the site were never publicly accounted for. County pay records, fragmentary as they are for this period, show wages paid out to 8 of the 9 names for the weeks prior to the final cut, but no further employment record for any of them in the quarrying trade in that county after that autumn. Whether they scattered to other work, other towns, other lives entirely, or whether something else happened to them, the surviving records simply do not say. Whitlock himself continued as foreman at the quarry's main operation for another 4 years, according to company payroll fragments, before resigning in 1888 and, as far as any record shows, leaving the region entirely. What happened to him after that is unknown. The ledger itself disappeared from any record for nearly 90 years. It resurfaced in 1971, when a man clearing out a collapsed toolshed on what had once been quarry company land found a rusted metal toolbox wedged beneath a fallen support beam, the kind of toolbox a foreman might have carried between job sites, containing a handful of surveying instruments long since seized with rust, and the ledger itself, its pages swollen and stained but largely legible, preserved just well enough by the sealed box and the dry conditions beneath the collapsed shed to survive the intervening decades. The man who found it, by his own account given years later to a regional historical group, said he almost didn't open the box at all, that something about the weight and the way the hinges resisted made him want to leave it exactly where it had fallen. He opened it anyway. What he found inside, and what eventually made its way, page by page, into the hands of people willing to take it seriously, is everything that's been described here. It took nearly a decade after that 1971 discovery for the ledger to reach anyone with the patience to research it properly, and the person who eventually did, a regional archivist working out of a small county historical society, spent years cross-referencing what fragments of it she could against surviving pay records, land deeds, and county death registers, trying to determine what had actually become of the 9 men who walked off that site in 1884. What she found, or rather what she didn't find, is almost as unsettling as the ledger itself. Of the 9 names, only 3 appear in any later record at all, anywhere, under any spelling. Old Rafferty's name turns up once more, 11 years later, in a death notice from a town nearly 200 miles away. An obituary that lists him only as a former quarryman, survived by no listed family, with no mention of where he had worked in the intervening years. Titus Grady's name appears in a labour dispute record from a different quarry operation entirely, dated 1887, suggesting he did eventually return to the trade, just never again in Marrow Hollow. And the German HV appears once in a naturalisation filing from 1890, the only record that gives any hint of a full name, though the archivist who found it has, for reasons she's never fully explained publicly, declined to release it. The other 6 men, Amos Teller, Jonas Pruitt, Ezra Combs, both Hobbs brothers, and Daniel Marsh, simply vanish from every available record after that autumn. No death notices, no later employment, no land transactions, nothing. People do vanish from historical records for mundane reasons, of course. Poor record keeping, migration to places where records weren't kept as carefully, simple bad luck in what survived and what didn't. But 6 out of 9, all from the same crew, all in the same season, is the kind of statistic that tends to stay with a researcher long after she's closed the file. The Quarry Company itself dissolved sometime in the early 1900s, its assets and land holdings sold off piecemeal, the records of that sale so fragmentary that nobody has ever been able to fully trace who owns the mineral rights to that hollow today, if anyone does at all. The land above ground passed through at least 4 private owners across the 20th century, none of whom, according to local accounts, ever did anything with the old quarry site beyond occasionally running cattle through the cleared sections, nowhere near the abandoned northern face. It's the kind of forgetting that happens naturally to small, unremarkable industrial sites all over that part of the country, quarries and mines that operated for a few decades and then closed and were left to the weather, except that most of those sites don't come with a foreman's ledger describing a sound that rose and fell like breathing, and most of them don't have a 9-foot block of pale stone still sitting 3/4 cut, waiting, as Whitlock put it in his own hand, for someone willing to finish what 9 men decided, all at once and without a word passed between them, that they would not finish themselves. The block itself, the actual stone Whitlock's crew spent 6 weeks cutting and never freed, is still there. The fencing the company put up in 1884 has long since rotted and fallen, the northern face of the old quarry, reclaimed by scrub brush and thin trees that have found purchase in the disturbed ground, but the block itself is unmistakable to anyone who finds their way out to that hollow. 3 sides cut with the same clean, patient precision, visible in every other piece of stone that quarry ever produced. The 4th side still rough, still fused, exactly as Whitlock described it, exactly as 9 men left it on a Thursday afternoon in the autumn of 1884, when something about that hollow tone rising and falling beneath their feet told them, all at once and without a word passed between them, that this was one cut that was never meant to be finished. Nobody living can tell you with certainty what was behind that wall. The cavity Whitlock described, the marks along its walls spaced with a regularity no chisel of that era should have produced, the sound that started as a resonance and became, by his own account, something closer to breath. None of it has ever been independently verified, because nobody has gone back to open that fourth side and see what 6 weeks of careful work left unfinished. Maybe that's simply because the site is remote, overgrown, forgotten by everyone except the handful of people who've traced Whitlock's ledger back to its source. Or maybe, and this is the part of the story that tends to sit with people long after they've stopped listening, maybe nobody has gone back because some quiet, unspoken agreement passed down from that Quarry crew to whoever came after them. An agreement never written down anywhere except in the space between Whitlock's last full sentence and the 4 words that follow it, "Tell them the rock said no." An agreement that some things, once you've heard them ask, you simply do not answer with a chisel. There's one more detail worth including before we leave this story where it stands, because it's the detail that tends to change how people feel about the whole account once they hear it. When the archivist who traced the crew's later records finally made her way out to the hollow herself, sometime in the early 1980s, she brought with her a copy of Whitlock's sketch of the cavity opening, the rough diagram he'd drawn in the margin of one entry showing the dimensions of the hollow relative to the block being cut. She wanted, by her own account, simply to confirm the block was real, to stand in front of it, and satisfy herself that at least that much of the ledger held up against the physical world. It did. The block was exactly where the sketch placed it, exactly the dimensions Whitlock had recorded, 3 sides cut clean, the 4th still fused. What she noted afterward, in a private letter to a colleague that only surfaced years later, was something the ledger itself never directly claims, something Whitlock either never noticed or never let himself write down. Standing at the site, in the quiet of a late afternoon with no wind and no birds calling, she said she heard, or thought she heard, a low tone rising up from somewhere beneath the ground, faint enough that she assumed at first it was blood moving in her own ears, present for perhaps 30 seconds before it faded away entirely. She never went back a second time. She never published anything about the sound itself, only the archival research, the wage records, the vanished names, the parts of the story that could be footnoted and defended in the ordinary language of historical research. But the letter survived, tucked among her other papers, and it ends with a line that echoes Whitlock's own final entry, closely enough that it's hard to believe it was written without that entry in mind. She wrote, simply, that she understood, now, why nobody had ever gone back to finish the cut, and that she didn't intend to be the one who tried. The stone is still there, the cut is still unfinished. And somewhere in that hollow, if the wind sits right and the evening goes quiet, the way it did for Elias Whitlock on that last Thursday in 1884, some people who've made the walk out to see it for themselves swear they can still hear something underneath the silence, low and patient, rising and falling, waiting the way it's been waiting since before anyone thought to ask what it was waiting for.